Welcome to Prajim Technologies. I am Venkat. This is part 54 of ASP.NET video series. In this session, we'll discuss about server.execute method and the difference between server.transfer and server.execute. Before continuing with the session, I strongly recommend to watch parts 51, 52 and 53 of this video series. Server.execute is very similar to server.transfer. Let's actually look at an example of using server.execute. Let's flip to Visual Studio. Here I have a very simple ASP.NET web application project with two web forms. On web form 1, I have two text boxes where the user can enter their name and email. And once they click this button, server.execute web form 2, they will be redirected to web form 2.aspx. And on this web form, I have two label controls, which will then retrieve the values that we enter in these text boxes and display them within those label controls. And to just distinguish between the two web forms, we have this H1. This is web form 1 and this is web form 2. Alright, so first let's code the redirection. So once I double click the button control, we have the event handler generated. So server.execute method, I want to use the execute method to redirect the user, and this method is expecting a single string parameter, which is nothing but the path of the page we want to redirect the user to. Here we want to redirect the user to webform2.aspx, so ~webform2.aspx. Okay, so once we redirect the user to webform2 on the page load event of webform2.aspx.cs, we need to write code to retrieve the values from these text boxes and display them in the label controls on this web form. And obviously we have seen how to do that in the previous session of this video series when we were discussing about server.transfer. The exact same techniques are applicable here as well. So we can use the request object's form property. And if you look at the request object's form property, this is going to give us a collection of the previous form variables. And if you look at what it's returning, it is returning a name value collection, name value pair collection object. And that object is present in system.collections.specialized namespace. So let's declare a variable of that type. So system.collections.specialized name value collection, and let's call this previous form variables is equal to request.form, and then we can use this object to retrieve the text from the text box name and text box email. So let's see how to do that. So which is nothing but, let's copy the object name here, previous form variables, and then to this we can pass the name of the text box control on the previous web form, which is nothing but txt name, and then this can be assigned to label name variable. Label name.text is equal to whatever we get back, and along the same lines we can do the same thing for txt email and assign the text from that text box to label email. So it's pretty much similar to what we have seen in the previous session of this video series. Alright, now let's go ahead and run this and see if the values that we enter on web form 1 will be transferred to the label controls on web form 2. And remember, here we are using server.execute method, and look at the URL. We are currently on web form 1 and the URL is webform1.aspx. So let's say the name is Prajim and email is prajim@prajimtech.com, and then once we click this server.execute method, we should be redirected to web form 2. So we are on web form 2. Look at that. This is the primary difference between server.transfer and server.execute. Now we are still on web form 1, but web form 2 result is also shown here. And look at the URL. The URL is still web form 1. Okay, so if you look at the major difference between server.transfer and server.execute is this: server.transfer terminates the execution of the current page and starts the execution of the new page, whereas server.execute processes the second web form without leaving the first web form. You will still be on the first web form, and the output of the second web form will be displayed on the first web form. After completing the execution of the first web form, the control returns to the second web form. Let's understand what we mean by this. Okay, now let me close this. On web form 1, look at that, I have this button control, which when we click, we go to webform2.aspx. Now on this web form, I also have a label control here. Now all I am doing here, and if you look at the ID of that label, it's called LBL status. That's the ID of the label. So what I'm going to do is, in this button click event, I'm going to set the text LBL status.text is equal to. Now look at this. When we click the button, we are telling, okay, server.execute webform2.aspx, which means at this point it's going to start executing, webform2 page load event and all the events on webform2. And then after the processing of webform2, the call is going to come back to webform1. Okay, and then it will execute this line, and that's the proof for us, to tell the call is coming back to webform1. Let's say completed processing webform1. Okay, and it should be back here setting the text to the label. Actually, let's put a breakpoint to prove that, and let's run this. So when the page first loads, we will be on webform1, and we will be able to enter the txt name, the value for txt name and txt email. And once we click this button on this webform1, it will redirect us to webform2. In the sense, it will start executing the events of webform2, and then as soon as it finishes processing webform2, the control should come back to webform1. So let's say Prajim, and let's say the email is test. I click server.execute. Look at that, it hits the breakpoint. So F10, so server.execute, it's going to go to webform2. So let's put a breakpoint there. So the page load of webform2 should be executed now. So I press F10, so we get to page load of webform2. It finishes processing that, and then look at that, the control come back to the first web form. Okay, so completed processing web form 1, and it came back, and look at that, the output of the web form 2 and web form 1 is combined here. Whereas if we use server.transfer, it terminates the execution of the current page and starts the execution of the new page. And the call doesn't come back to the first page because it has already terminated the execution of the current page. And to just prove that, let's stop debugging. So debug, stop debugging. And then what we are going to do here is, instead of server.execute, I'm going to use server.transfer here. Okay, it's exactly the same code. And now let's run this page. And obviously, as you might expect, actually we want to debug it. So let's put a breakpoint there and then run the project. So we have the breakpoint already. So we'll run this. Now what happens, since we are using server.transfer, the server.transfer will end the current web form execution. So let's say Prajim and test, and I click this button. Look at what's going to happen. As soon as it encounters this line server.transfer, it goes there, F10, F10, F10. So this is web form 2, and I press F5. Look at that, it doesn't come back to web form 1. Okay, which means it's currently, server.transfer terminates the execution of the current page and starts the execution of the new page, whereas server.execute processes the second web form without leaving the first web form. After completing the execution of the first web form, the control returns back to the second web form. That's the major difference between server.transfer and server.execute. Otherwise, there are many similarities between server.transfer and server.execute. The URL in the browser remains the first page URL. So if you remember, whether we use server.transfer or server.execute, the redirection is happening on the server without the knowledge of the client, without the client knowing. That's why the URL in the browser doesn't get updated. Okay, that's one similarity. Let's put back this to server.execute. And server.transfer and server.execute can only be used to navigate to sites or pages on the same web server. Trying to navigate to sites or pages on a different web server causes runtime exception. And we have seen how this runtime exception happens when we are talking about server.transfer as well. So let me click this button, server.execute. So we have the event handler there. So when I say server.execute and I want to go to, let's say, http://prajimtech.com, this website is not hosted on this laptop. So obviously this is present on a different web server. So trying to navigate to that URL using server.execute will throw a runtime exception. So let's run this. and then once we click that button, and when it tries to navigate to an external website that's hosted on a different web server, we get a runtime error. So again, server.execute is similar to server.transfer in that aspect. And server.transfer and server.execute preserves the form variables from the original request. And we have seen how to do that. By default, it preserves that. But then you have a Boolean property, which you can set, to false if you don't want to preserve those values. So if I set that to false, and then if we run this, as you might expect, the previous form values will not be preserved. But then if we, okay, so let's say Prajim, and then when I set it to test, now look at that, it's not showing those values. That is because you have intentionally set, the preserve form values parameter to false. And actually there is another way to retrieve, just like server.transfer, when we transfer from one web form to another web form using server.execute, another way to retrieve the previous form values is to use the previous page property. And we have seen how to use that when we are talking about server.transfer. So the page class has got previous page property, so we can use this, and previous page returns a page object. So I'm just going to say this as previous page is equal to that if the previous page is not equal to null, then what we want to do, we want to find the previous page for web form 2 is web form 1, because we are coming to web form 2 from web form 1. So, and on the previous page that's on web form 1, we know that we have a control called txt name, and we know that that control is a text box. But if you look at this find control method, it is returning the control back, and we want to typecast that to be of type text box. So I'm going to typecast that to be of type text box, and then we can retrieve the text out of it. And then we can set that to lbl name.text. And along the same lines, we can retrieve the email. The name of the email text box is txt email, and the label name is email. Okay, so let's comment this out. So now we are using previous page technique. So obviously let's run this page. Now when we are using the previous page property, then this parameter doesn't have any impact. It's always going to retain those values, the previous page values. Once the page loads, we can enter the values here. So Prajim test, and I click this button, it retains those values. Okay, another very important point to keep in mind is that, let's say I have a button on web form 2. Let's insert a row below, and then let's put a button control here, which is going to post back to the web server. And all this button going to do is it will simply post back to the server. So I'm just going to change the text to post back. We're not going to have any server-side code for this one. So once I click this button, there's an event handler, but we are not going to do anything there. Okay, so let's run this now. So remember, we are using the server.execute technique here to redirect the user. Let's get rid of this one. Let's run it once again. So once the page loads, we can enter the values. Let's say Prajim and test. So I click this button server.execute. So we are on web form 2. Now there is a button on web form 2. Now look at the URL. We are currently on webform1.aspx. Now, and this is web form 2. So obviously this button control is on web form 2. Now once I click on this button, and once the web form posts back, look at what happens to the output. Look at that, the output of web form 1 is gone, and look at the URL, it got changed to web form 2. Okay. On this slide, you can find resources for ASP.NET C# and SQL Server interview questions. That's it for today. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.